The committees on Information Technology and National Security will come to order again. For the record, General Alexander had to depart for a prior engagement. And now I would like to call on the ranking member of the National Security Subcommittee, Mr. Lynch, for his round of questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And again, I thank the witnesses. Mr. Singer, in your written testimony for today's hearing, one of the ways in which you indicate the United States could strengthen its cybersecurity protocols is through the continued development of international norms of conduct between nation states. And I think that's correct. But I do know that we have had a recent problem with the SWIFT network, which is an international banking network that is critical to our economy and especially to our international finance community. The difficulty there is that we've had evidence that there were several possible points of vulnerability, one being the Bangladeshi bank that was the principal bank, but also we've got cooperation by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in forwarding $81 million to a Philippine casino, and so these people actually got away with this. This is $81 million through the SWIFT network that was actually achieved by the hackers. I know they tried to transfer about $1.8 billion. They got away with $81 million. Still, it's very concerning because of the importance of the SWIFT network. And I'm just wondering, you know, if you go by the theory that we're only strong as our weakest link, there are some suspect practices in Bangladesh and in the Philippines that people think may have contributed to that hack. And in addition, I think there are a dozen banks that have been now identified and had contact with FireEye, which is the security firm that was involved at the Bangladesh Central Bank. So all of the banks are Southeastern banks, Southeast Asia. None of the banks, except for the Fed, and apparently they have the right codes and the right protocols from the Bangladesh Central Bank. But no banks in the United States, no banks in Western Europe. The implication could be that those banks in Southeast Asia did not have the firewalls, did not have the cybersecurity systems that the European banks and U.S. banks have. So how do we approach that? Especially, I mean, you could take an approach that people are not allowed to participate if they don't have a robust cybersecurity system in place. But that would put a lot of developing countries, Nigeria, perfect example, growing economy, that would shut a lot of people out from you know, the international banking community. So it presents difficulties, but the size of these hacks, these breaches, is problematic. So we've got to do something. I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts since you raised it in your written testimony.
I'd raise three things. First, I agree completely with you that the attack on the SWIFT system is significant to the U.S. Because of what it means, not just for us, but the global financial system. So the first issue is, at least from colleagues in that world, they are not yet satisfied that that the fixes that are needed to be made, that the assurance that these kind of breaches can't happen again, they haven't received it in sort of a third-party validated manner. They're not, the confidence in the system isn't there, so we need to focus on how do we restore confidence in the system that these fixes have been made. Second is the idea of norm building. Norm building is not just identifying what kind of attacks should or shouldn't be allowed to happen. It's also for us to figure figure out identifying sorts of targets that everyone can agree should be off limits. So, for example, this is an area of concord that we might have with a China, with a Russia and the like, that attacks on these kind of targets may not be militarily significant, but they harm us all. So the norm building is going to have to be, it's the difference with the Cold War, where any kind of target was allowed, but the attack didn't happen. Now we have lots of different attacks, but it's focusing on which targets are allowed. The third category is actually to link to a different incident, which we haven't talked about, but I think is crucial to norm building. Essentially, the failure of the U.S. and the international community to respond to the December hack of the Ukrainian power grid. This is the first proven takedown of this kind. It's the long discussed nightmare scenario. It's a violation of a widely agreed norm not to target civilian infrastructure with the intent to cause widespread and disproportionate damage. And yet, in the story of action and consequence, we had action. So far, we've had no consequence. So if we're talking about norm building, SWIFT is a great example, but the Ukraine one, I think, is even more important for us to wrestle with.
Yeah, that's great. I'm not sure if, Mr. Painter, you have anything you would like to add?
Yeah, if I could.
Or Mr. Kinnock or Mr. Hughes?
Look, I think the building, and part of the solution to this is the long-term norm building, and this is something we've undertaken, and frankly, as I said, we've led on. And the idea is, and there is this very high level of cyber war, which we don't see, and frankly don't see every day, but there's a lot of conduct we see below that level. And we made a lot of progress in a short time, and not only getting countries that are like-minded to agree, but also getting China and Russia, for instance, to agree. And the norms we've been promoting are, for instance, don't attack the critical infrastructure of another country absent wartime that provides services to the public. Don't attack CERTs, don't attack the emergency response, computer emergency response teams. Don't use them for bad, use them for defensive purposes. And an expectation that if you get a request from another state and there's malicious code coming or activity coming from that state, that you're going to mitigate it through technical or law enforcement means. And then finally, don't steal the intellectual property using cyber means of another country for your commercial benefit. And that's new, and we're promoting that, and that's some of the stuff we've been doing in the G20. If you look at literally every time the president has a meeting with a foreign leader, every single time, and the Nordic Summit is an example, the Modi visit just recently is another, you'll see a big statement on cyber, including these norms. That's a real priority.
Yeah, thank you.
I'd like to recognize Mr. Russell for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And gentlemen, thank you for being here. It's been a really insightful discussion. And I guess on what was mentioned earlier by General Alexander, I believe, talking about the rise of ransomware and these Bitcoin hostage-taking of servers in businesses. We see it all the way down to small businesses as a preferred method. Too difficult to fight, not a big enough dollar amount to matter, and they're raking the public for millions of dollars. Could you speak to that a little bit? And then I've got another line that I'd like to discuss after that. Whoever would like to take that, or anyone that wants to comment on that.
I think one of the issues you point to is the magnitude of specific incidents. And during my work at ODNI, and certainly in some of Director Clapper's testimony in the past, he's talked about the cumulative effect of low to moderate level attacks that are already compromising U.S. economic competitiveness and national security. So I would simply draw attention to that. It's analytically recognized that the cumulative impact can be very significant even if individual events are not that large. And then that becomes a policy response or a legislative or regulatory issue for policy determinations of how and when to respond. But analytically speaking, the mere fact that you're not seeing singular gigantic events should not put anyone at ease about the problem, because the cumulative effects are very, very significant and deleterious.
And I'm not even sure that it's due to these hostile nation militaries. This is from. I've actually had constituents that have they've been pirated. Their servers have been frozen. We've seen things like this. Mr. Singer, and then you, Mr. Painter. Thank you.
I would agree completely, and it points again to the value of the resilience node in a strategy where the way to mitigate these attacks is to spread best practices, and second, to help spur on the development of the cyber insurance industry that both backstops these victims but also helps incentivize them to have the best practices that avoid it. Second, it's a great example of how it points to the value of an offensive hit back within the cyber realm wouldn't do anything to solve this problem. This is why you have to have a very diverse strategy.
Yeah, I agree with that. Mr. Painter?
And I'd say three things. One, hardening the targets. This emphasizes by hardening the targets, which is a difficult job, is so important. And our colleagues from DHS who are not here can speak to that especially, but also the private sector. The second is, this is just an evolution of a threat we've seen before. I remember a case when I was a justice where then Mayor Bloomberg, or then, he wasn't mayor then, when Bloomberg had his business, someone hacked into his information. They threatened to expose all of it if he didn't pay them ransom, and he cooperated with the FBI, and they arrested the guy. But so this is the newest iteration of that kind of a threat, and it certainly has very damaging characteristics. But one thing, and again, I defer to my justice colleagues on this, that we did in the fraud cases where you had lots of small frauds, and they end up sometimes being the same actors, is you look at how you aggregate that. You share intelligence, so you look at the actors and you go after the actors.
Well, and it seems to me, and Mr. Singer, you had made mention of best practices and things. There's just some basic things that could be done. One, report it to the FBI. It might seem insignificant to them, to the business, but it is important in a collective thing. And then the other thing, routine backups, changes, all of that, things that we kind of take for granted. Really, we're looking at a sphere of technology not unlike 100 years ago in the electronic warfare sphere. We were using telegraphs, then we were using wireless, then we had towers and communication, and then satellite, and we saw the maturation of electronic warfare. And I would argue that a lot of our systems that we have in place today with regard to electronic warfare is the same sphere for cyber attack. They use the same power sources, the same type of infrastructure to spread out and branch, even with the digital. I see it very much like that electronic warfare, a war in the shadows. Isn't there a way that we could also do strike back attack in that war on the shadows that's not public? And I leave that with whoever wants to answer that.
And I guess the one comment I would make to that is we've tried to actually do the opposite of that through the release of our most recent strategy and try to normalize activities in cyber so that it is out of the shadows, so there's more transparency around what we're doing and a better understanding both from our allies, the American people, as well as our adversaries as to what our intentions are. I think it's when folks view it as being in the shadows, there's more questions about what the activity, what we're doing to respond to malicious activity. So I think we're trying to normalize operations in the domain and not make it more classified.
I think Mr. Hughes raises an important point about increasing transparency. Clearly, certain intelligence activities, to include covert action, may have their place at certain times and in certain instances, but normalizing and increasing transparency could be greatly helpful. And I offer that what any nation would choose to do sets precedents that are very difficult to prevent other nations from copying in the future. So a question would have to be asked, would you want that to be the rule that all countries obeyed of operating on partial or medium confidence attribution to be taking clandestine action with deleterious effects? That could be a dangerous environment if everyone is not acting with very, very high standards of attribution and preventing collateral damage.
If I may, very quickly, I think, we can't discuss it in this environment because it's a classified presidential directive, but we can say that there is a presidential directive that deals with this, and it's important for countries to have doctrine around this. So there is that kind of predictability that Sean talked about. And our doctrine does two things. It makes sure that everything is integrated. We're not just thinking about these things separately, but we're integrating all our capabilities and all of the different equities involved. And two, that we're going to favor network security and law enforcement as our first lines of defense and then look at other tools after that.
Yeah, as I close, Mr. Chairman, thank you for your indulgence. You know, I guess there's a part of me and the warrior in me. Do you want to answer a Sony attack with a Stuxnet, or do you want to wish that you had good practices and everybody cooperates? I personally think there has to be a balance of both. If we show ourselves weak, this problem's only going to grow. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
The gentleman from California, Mr. Liu, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Hughes, thank you for your public service. I have some questions for you. Earlier this year, Defense Secretary Carter stated that encryption was absolutely critical to the Department of Defense in terms of protecting cybersecurity. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, Department of Defense systems rely on encryption for our communication out in the field and with our partners, absolutely.
He also stated that he opposed backdoors that would weaken encryption. Do you agree with that as well?
I would support the Secretary's position for the department.
And I just want to make sure that the Department's view is that we need to move to stronger encryption, not weaker encryption. Is that correct?
I'd support the Secretary's position on encryption.
Thank you. So now I'd like to ask you, in your job, do you deal with telephone networks, communications as part of what you deal with in your role in terms of cybersecurity?
So I think there's collaborations between what my office does for operational oversight, international partnerships, and interagency collaboration of cyber policy, and what the DoD CIO does from oversight from a network security and telephony perspective. My office, per se, does not cover telephony protocols or any of the technical specifics.
Earlier this year, it was revealed that there was a flaw known as a signaling system number 7 flaw in our telephone networks. As I understand it, decades ago, when they set up these networks, and let's say you had to make a call to Africa, you know, the U.S. network would hand off to the European network, then hand off to the African network, and it was assumed that these networks would be trusted. It turns out that some of these networks are owned by foreign adversaries like Russia or Iran, or criminal syndicates related to these foreign adversaries. Have you looked at that issue at all?
I have to take that question for the record. It's not something that my office in particular has looked at.
Who in the DoD would be looking at that issue?
I'd have to take that for the record. I would assume the CIO, DoD CIO would look into that, but I would have to get back to you on that.
If you could, that'd be great. Because as I understand it, if a foreign government exploits this SS7 flaw, which any foreign government that has a telephone network can, it then allows them to listen in on phone conversations of anybody's cell phone, just knowing that cell phone number, track their movements, and get their text messages. It always struck me as odd when we go on these codels abroad, we get all these briefings on don't take your smartphone, have these protections, make sure you follow all these cybersecurity hygiene tips when you're in these foreign countries, when it turns out that these foreign countries can just listen in our phone conversations, knowing our cell phone number right here in the United States. So if we can get some information back on that and whether the problem's been fixed, it'd be helpful. And then I have some questions related to the Obama administration's new cybersecurity workforce strategy that was announced yesterday. One of the proposals is to increase funding and salaries to recruit and retain talented cyber professionals. So I have a question for you, Mr. Hughes, as well as you, Mr. Painter. I'd like to know what is the issue with that? How important is it? And second, what is your sort of view on your ability to retain people once you get them in the cybersecurity field?
So I can speak to the Secretary's Force of the Future initiatives around the Department of Defense. I'm not familiar with the specific program that the administration just released writ large. Specific to Department of Defense, we're always looking at novel ways to bring in more, bring in and recruit and retain more talented professionals across a variety of domains. We understand the acute challenges of retaining our highly trained and skilled personnel that operate on the cyber systems. And so the Secretary's Force of the Future initiative is looking at a variety of different ways to have more permeability between private sector and government service, as well as different ways to bring in folks to serve in different positions, both military and civilian.
And
Thank you.
I would say, yes, this is part of the larger administration attempt to really bolster our cybersecurity. One of the problems we face, not as much in my shop because I'm a policy shop, but certainly throughout the government, is finding qualified people who do cybersecurity. We're competing with the private sector. It's still a fairly small pool. I'd say that there are schools, and we've been working with schools to get programs to have more people dealing with this. I should say that I was a 9-year resident of your district, and I suspect that many of them live in your district, and I do miss it every day. So if you can convince them to come out here, that would be great.
Thank you. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Heiss from Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin with you, Mr. Hughes, but if others of you have some input, feel free to jump in here. But what are the factors that define a cyber act of war as opposed to a cyber attack?
So again, as I mentioned in my opening statement, cyber incidents are reviewed on a case-by-case basis. We take into account loss of life, injury to person, destruction of property, and the national security leadership and the president will make a determination if it's a armed attack. But I defer to Mr. Painter for a more thorough response.
And if I would echo that completely. I think that it's an effects-based test, just like it is in the physical world. So we're not using a separate test for the physical.
So at what point do we, what are the rules of engagement that would determine a response, be it a cyber response or kinetic?
Again, not to sound cliche, but again, it'll be on a case-by-case basis. We'll evaluate each incident on its merits and make a determination, again, through a whole of government collaboration on what the response might be.
So who makes that decision? Is it the president alone, or are there multiple agencies or representatives from agencies that would be involved?
The national security leadership in conjunction with the president make that determination.
But I would say that as we look at these, there's a range of different activities, and you use the term cyber warfare. But the question often is, what constitutes an armed attack under international law that would then give a right to self-defense? But even if it's below that threshold, we still have a number of ways to respond. It could be kinetic, it could be through cyber means, it could be through economic means and sanctions, it could be through diplomacy, it could be through indictments and law enforcement actions. And what we've done, and this is one of the things, having tracked this for so long, I've seen is a real change, and a really beneficial change, is there is a very, very strong interagency process that as we're looking at these threats, I mean, Aaron and I in particular, we talk all the time, but all the different interagency colleagues do talk about these threats, talk about possible responses. In the end, it's up to the national security staff and the president, but we look at all these different opportunities. If it's a criminal matter, justice will take it, for instance. So we'll look at our tools.
I'm concerned with the lack of clarity on this and the bureaucratic, multi-layered involvement to make a decision. And now we have Cyber Command in Fort Gordon. If Cybercom were elevated to a full combatant command, would that help?
I think we're always looking at ways to make the military establishment more efficient and effective. I wouldn't say that elevation of Cyber Command in and of itself would help in a determination of cyber incident being an armed attack versus other types of malicious activity.
Mr. Singer?
To weigh in from outside of government, essentially in defining whether it's a war or not, many of the same measures would be used, whatever the means, cyber or physical. To put it bluntly, is throughout history, it's decided by, does it combine a political intent and mass violence of some kind, physical violence, death, injury. So as an example, there are cyber attacks that steal secrets. They are incredibly vexing, but no nation has ever gone to war over just their secrets being stolen. But that judgment, the judgment though is a political judgment on when it's an act of war. And my hope is, and this is the value of this hearing, that it's not just the president or the NSC, but it's also Congress traditionally has decided when the U.S. is at war or not.
Well, yes, to some extent. But let's go down that path a little bit further then. Can a member of NATO invoke Article 5 for a cyber attack?
Yes, they can. In fact, there's been a lot of activity in NATO since 2012. Cyber is part of NATO's operating construct. We just had a leaders level meeting for NATO where they agreed, among other things, they previously agreed international law applies, including the law of armed conflict. They are doing cyber strategies that Aaron can talk more to. But one of the things that was agreed to back in, I think it was 2014, is that cyber could qualify under Article 5. And that
Okay, well then let me ask this. Does NATO have a definition of what constitutes a cyber attack? Saying that we don't.
First, I think it's not true that we don't have a definition. We just talked about what would qualify and the factors you would use. I would have to go back and look at NATO's doctrine, but I think they have a lot of focus on this. They understand the risks out there, and they're building their capability.
All right, well, our definition was not clearly communicated to me. It was going to be left up to the President and others based on certain factors, and somewhere they're going to make a decision. But I see my time has expired. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your indulgence. I yield back.
The gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Blum, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. And thank you to our witnesses today for providing us some insights into this growing problem of cyber security. I come from the private sector. I've been operating in the private sector my entire career. So I'd like to chat a little bit about China and the United States private sector. And while most of my questions would be toward Mr. Painter from the State Department, anyone else feel free to jump in. Mr. Painter, the State Department's Overseas Security Advisory Council, OSAC, recently concluded that despite media's reporting that Chinese cyber attacks are decreasing, cases of Chinese espionage campaigns against the U.S. private sector are ongoing. Which sectors, Mr. Painter, do you think are most at risk for these Chinese cyber attacks?
Look, I think the DNI has talked about this, and we continue to see intrusions into systems, both government systems and private sector systems for espionage purposes. What we agreed to with China, which was significant, is that they would not break into private sector systems to steal intellectual property or trade secrets or business proprietary information for the purposes of benefiting their commercial sector. On that, we've been pushing them very hard. There's a number of ways we've been doing that. It was really a remarkable fact that they came to that agreement when President Xi was here, and we said we're going to hold them accountable. We're still going to use all the tools that we have, and the jury is still out. I think Admiral Rogers recently testified saying we are watching closely, but the jury is still out.
Any other comments on that question?
Again, I left government on May 9th of this year, but up until that point, I would concur with what Chris has just said. Having been the office that was charged with making those determinations on behalf of the U.S. government, the jury is still out, or it was as of May 9th. And I will just offer two other considerations that one has to think about is, and I mentioned this in my written statement, modus operandi may change, so behavioral patterns may change, and the question of volume or quantity versus rate of success and quality of foreign activities is something that needs to be considered. So I would recommend that if that is an issue that is of interest to you, sir, that's probably better for closed hearings with my colleagues or others from the intelligence agencies in the future, but asking what the current impacts are and what, if anything, has changed and metrics, that kind of attribution analysis is very, very difficult, and you quickly get into classified discussions. But it's a worthwhile question and one we grappled with for my 5 years at ODNI.
Mr. Singer.
If I understood your question, it was, in essence, who's being targeted, and it's a confluence of two factors. It's one, what are their national priorities for economic success? To put it another way, what industries do they want to be global leaders? And those are industries that have been most targeted for intellectual property theft in the past. The agreement may change that. And the second is vulnerabilities. Where are the weak links and who are they able to get into? And that again points to the value of a resilience-based strategy where it's effective, be it against the threat of intellectual property theft to the threat from cyber terrorists to China in a military means. Good defense actually is good defense.
Well, Mr. Painter?
And I would certainly agree with the hardening the target issue, which we've raised a number of times. But I also say it's not just the U.S. So one of the important things is a lot of other countries have raised this concern. The UK has raised it, Germany has raised it, and others. And the G20 statement that I talked about, where there was an affirmation among the leaders of the G20 that this conduct was impermissible, I think is also important. It sets a metric that we can hold people accountable by.
Relative to China, and since we're talking about cyber attacks in the private sector, one would think the reason for China doing this would be economic. But is there any military reason China would be attacking our private sector? Maybe Mr. Hughes would have some insights into this. Or what are your thoughts? Are these attacks, cyber attacks, mainly private sector economic, or are they also military?
I think they're probably targeting our private sector companies to enhance their national security apparatus as well. I'm sure that some of our defense industrial-based companies are being targeted by the Chinese to benefit their military development and advancement of their technologies.
Mr. Painter, any other insights on that?
No, I would agree. I would think that you'll see, just as the DNI said, a full spectrum of targets given the information that's out there.
Have, in fact, China's cyber attacks, the amount of them decreased over the last 5 years? Is that a fact?
I would defer to that question to the closed hearing and to the intelligence community.
I would agree with that. I think that would be a ripe subject for the closed hearing. What I can say is, in terms of the theft of intellectual property for commercial purposes, as Admiral Rogers said, the jury is still out on that, and I believe the DNI said that too. But with respect to any more detail, we can get that into another setting.
Mr. Singer?
As to the question on the goal of intellectual property theft not just being economic, it definitely has a national security side, and the easy answer to you would be Google images of F-35 and J-31, and you will see a remarkable similarity between our most expensive weapons project and their new jet fighter system. And they either it's coincidentally they look alike or there's something else going on.
What can Congress do to provide additional deterrence to countries like China, as far as maybe criminal law, for example? What more can we do? What are your suggestions? And I'm thinking of China specifically here, but it applies to all nations, obviously. Here's your chance. Here's your chance. Tell us what to do.
I would offer that this is really an issue of strategic reality, incentives, disincentives, and consequences. We've talked about attribution, public attribution, and that there may be no bite behind a bark. I would offer you have to look at very complex bilateral relationships, certainly if you're talking about the United States and China, but also with other countries, and ask what would strategically incentivize or decentivize changes in behavior. Having served 16 years in the intelligence community, for me it was about what was actually happening, not what was being said. And again, to get into the very particulars of that, about volumes of activity or impact of activity, that is again something I would say that the current serving members of the intelligence community and other executive agencies would be better off discussing in a closed session.
I would just add that the fact that in this case, the president and at the highest levels of our government, obviously the president raising this with the president of China as not just an issue of cyber versus cyber, but an issue that affected the overall relationship had a big impact.
And if I have time for one more question, Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to ask the panel, has there been any noticeable effect following the Department of Justice 2014 indictment of the PLA officers? Has there been any noticeable effect?
From my observation, that became a strong topic of discussion between U.S. government and Chinese government officials, and I defer to my colleagues who are still in government regarding that. And there were also negative ramifications for certain U.S. companies who had business opportunities in China very quickly curtailed. So it had a economic and business impact on U.S. entities, and it also certainly was a central part of the discussions, of the policy discussions, which are better answered by the policy departments.
Mr. Painter?
And part I defer to my colleagues who are not here from the Department of Justice, but I'd say that, yes, a dialogue we have with the Chinese about de-escalation and norms in cyberspace was suspended. We have now gotten back on another foot on that. which seemed an odd reaction to that. But nevertheless, I think it showed that we were serious, certainly, and that when that combined with the president raising it and the threat of sanctions and other things, I think likely brought the Chinese to the table, but that was more an assessment for others.
Any insights on that, Mr. Hughes?
Again, I would also defer to the intel community for classified assessment and then Department of Justice.
I have no further questions, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the time I do not have.
I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Once again, gentlemen, thank you all for being here. Thank you for your patience. You guys all are very influential in keeping us safe, and I appreciate that, and sorry to keep you away from your day jobs too long. This is a funny topic for me to be the chairman of, considering I spent most of my adult life in the clandestine world, right? But having everyone that has a role in this side by side, there's value to this, and I've taken a lot away from these conversations. So I really appreciate that, and I have some basic questions. And my first question is to everybody, and I don't ask this as a yes or no question. It's a really basic question. I'd welcome a little detail, and I'll start with you, Mr. Hughes. Do the bad guys know what we can do?
I think similar to the U.S. national security infrastructure, having intelligence agencies, our adversaries are also doing collection against us. In some instances, they're likely tracking our TTPs, so I would assert that they have some idea of our ability to exploit networks and get information. Absolutely.
Mr. Painter?
Yeah, I think also there's a benefit in the bad guys knowing what we can do to some extent. I mean, we certainly, in, for instance, the criminal law context, want to project that there'll be consequences for people's actions. So we want that we have economic tools we can use. We have other tools we can use. That's part of the deterrence message, is the bad guys knowing, whoever the bad guys might be, what you can do. And in that, I think what I've seen personally is that, we have made real progress in communicating that. And one of the questions was asked earlier about the Bangladeshi situation. Part of this is outside the U.S., which is part of my gig, which is working with other countries around the world so they have these capabilities too, especially.
And Mr. Canuck, before you get to that question, I'm going to ask you, Mr. Painter, to pick up on something you just said. Ukraine, Romania, Latvia, where are those countries where the legal framework is not there to allow the right kinds of prosecution? Because when it's not, we know how many attacks are coming from these different countries because there's not a legal framework in which for they to get prosecutors sued. Where are those places of biggest concern to you? What additional pressures should we be putting on these countries in order to establish that kind of framework?
So the countries, I think we've made a lot of progress, and especially my Department of Justice colleagues, and one of the things that we do is capacity building. So we work with DHS and DOJ. We've done things in Africa, a lot of regional trainings in Africa. We've worked with the EU and others. We want every country to have strong cybercrime. You can remember the I Love You virus, where the Philippines didn't have a law that punished this, and now they do. In fact, they've gone through several iterations of that. So, I don't think it's helpful to signal out countries and saying you're doing a bad job. I think it's more helpful to help us get in there and work with them, because they also recognize the economic value of this. If they have good cybercrime laws, people want to invest in their economy. They want to, you're going to promote innovation. So I think the Budapest Convention, which is a convention, the Budapest Cybercrime Convention, the one that we promote around the world, there's been a number of new signatories recently. We're working on getting more in Africa and Asia. Japan joined about a year and a half ago. So that's part of the push. Now, there are other countries, and this goes to more the policy issue, like Russia and China, who want a global, a UN convention, and we think that's just wasting time. We need to really, this is an urgent issue now, and countries need to be prepared for it.
Mr. Canuck, not only do the bad guys know what we can do, is there stuff that we should ensure the bad guys know that we can do? And the third piece is, I think the difficulty for a lot of us up here is when you talk, what is a digital act of war, the difference between a digital act of war and a gray area and a red line, what does all that mean? And we've had conversation about what is off limits. And I think sometimes part of the public conversation can articulate in a more granular level what is off limits, right? And so, and Mr. Singer, you made a great point about the Ukrainian grid attack. You know, if you look at, what is it, the UN's, you know, Chapter 7, Article 39, 41, 42, and 51 that talk about those things and where you can, you know, defend yourself. The grid is pretty clearly articulated there. What are some of those other gray areas that we should be exposing? I know there's a lot of questions in there, but, you know, you're a smart guy, Mr. Canuck. You can follow them all.
I'll do my best succinctly to hit the three. Starting the one that my colleagues have answered, I think our sophisticated adversaries fully understand the laws of physics, the nature of telecommunications equipment, how electromagnetic spectrum operates, and how software logic code does. They may not know exactly what accesses, or we may not know exactly what accesses any foreign government may have on any given day, or what hardware or software implants may exist. I would liken it to a poker game where everyone knows the cards in the deck, you don't know who's holding which cards in which hand, and those capabilities may be fleeting and in flux at any given time. Secondly, is there a benefit to letting anyone know what we can do in certain instances? Again, while I appreciate clandestine intelligence activities as a 16-year intelligence professional, there may also be reasons in certain cases to declare or show certain capabilities, akin to having a standing Navy or other armaments that are known for a credible deterrent effect. However, the nature of cyber tools differs in that if you reveal the particularities of a capability, an adversary may be able to develop countermeasures. So there'd be a very sensitive balance there, certainly at least against your most sophisticated adversaries. Regarding gray areas and red lines, I'd actually like to draw attention to two important points which are on the margins of some of the discussion we've heard today. A lot of discussion is focused on act of war. I actually think that's the wrong focus, as I stated in my written statement. Most of what we have seen foreign state actors doing has been intentionally designed to operate below the threshold that would trigger Articles 2.4, Article 51 of the UN Charter, or Articles 4.5 of the Washington Treaty. There is a cognizance by many actors to use cyber technologies in an asymmetric coercive tool for influence with the expressed interest of avoiding military conflict. So that is actually how these weapons and tools are being most utilized.
So, Mr. Canuck, on that, should we be lowering the bar?
Again, that's a policy decision. I think, for starters, we need to be cognizant of these low to moderate level activities and their cumulative effect, like we were discussing earlier with one of your colleagues. Where you actually draw red lines, that is a policy question. I think there are certain casualty levels and certain property damage levels that under an effects-based analysis would constitute an armed attack or an act of war. But that analysis, as has been stated earlier by the executive branch representatives here, is the same that you would use for non-cyber modalities. The last thing I'd like to, if I just may mention, focus is we need to pay more attention to what will be a problem more and more in the future of attacks on the integrity of data, not on its confidentiality and not on its availability. Director Clapper has made reference to that in his last two worldwide threat assessments, and I fear if ransomware is today's news, the future news is going to be integrity, value of information, not access to it.
Turning 10,000 into 1,000 or changing
what's seen on a air traffic controller's screen, changing information in the Twittersphere that will affect investors' actions, changing what the situational awareness that a military commander is seeing. Can you trust the information you're seeing to make actions upon it? That is actually the value of information, and that is what, unfortunately, this conflict space will turn to in the future more and more.
Great. And Mr. Singer, I'm going to add a question to you as well. And we talked about effects-based approach, and does an effects-based approach include intended effects or only the actual effects? Can we determine intended effects? Should we be trying to determine intended effects? And should our response be based on the interpretation of what we may think those intended effects are?
I'll hit that question first, because that's where I do believe the idea that we solely use an effects-based judgment is just not, it's not the way we actually approach it. So to use a non-cyber example, a bullet crosses the border into your district and kills someone. Effect. But we will judge whether we are at war or it is an act of war from Mexico as to whether is it fired by Mexican government with intent to kill, or is it an accidental discharge, be it by a Mexican government individual. Then we would ask the same question if it was a civilian or not. Intent does matter. It's one of the things that will be, at least in a political judgment, the kind of political judgment that would be made in the White House to deliberations in Congress, if it's going to make a declaration of war, it will judge intent as much as effect. The challenge is kind of figuring out the intent sometimes is going to be unclear.
Well, over the last couple of weeks, we've learned a whole lot about intent.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. But the second thing to hit your question about awareness, my belief is that the bad guys have no doubt of our offensive cyber capability. If they had any confusion about it, we had a series of policymaker leaks about the Stuxnet operation, and then we had a massive dump from Edward Snowden, which caused us a lot of problems, but it also showed off we are quite good in this realm. Right. The challenge is, if you look at the data, there is no evidence that that raised awareness of our offensive capability actually deterred attacks. Overall, data loss to America in general, citizens went up 55% the year after the Snowden leak. To many of the cases that we've talked about today, whether it's OPM, to ones we haven't talked about, the attacks on the Joint Chiefs email system, those all happened afterwards. But that's not to say that deterrence isn't working. So for example, there's lots of things that a China, a Russia, an Iran could do in this realm. They don't, in large part not merely because of our offensive cyber capability to hit back, but because we can hit back in other realms.
Well, I'd like to thank the ranking member for indulging me in going over, and I'm going to ask this last question to all of y'all, and this is going to, I recognize the difficulty in the question that I'm asking. It's probably not as difficult for Mr. Singer to ask, and Mr. Canuck has not been out of government long enough to be able to answer this question easily. Y'all are involved in policy, y'all are involved in operational activity, but I'm gonna ask you, what is the best next action for this House, for Congress, on this topic, to move the conversation to where, you know, we are having a whole of government response, or improving a whole of government response? You know, not the end goal, right? What's the next step? What would y'all like to see this legislative body do? And you don't need to take forever. We've already run out of time, but Mr. Singer, I think it's gonna be easiest for you to answer this question. So let's start you and go in reverse order. And Mr. Hughes, you get to get the last word.
I'll just hit again the written testimony points, particularly about how do we build up our resilience. And there's a series of things that Congress could do, and some of them are quite as simple as, for example, holding a hearing on the cybersecurity insurance industry and how could we bolster it, to there's actual small step mechanisms that could help it go on, to the examples of are there organizations that could be created and the like. But maybe to sum it up, the question for the Congress is, we know there's a series of best practices out there in private sector and government. How do you help aid their spread? And or where the executive branch has made a commitment to implement them, how do you hold their feet to the fire to ensure that they're actually doing it, particularly across another administration.
And we got the bipartisanship part down, you know, in your testimony. I think this is one of the things that has been great about this committee. Mr. Canuck?
It's been mentioned by a couple of my colleagues already, but I want to fully add my support to the discussion about resilience, and as one aspect of that, the growing insurance market in this space. When we did our analytic exchanges and outreaches, we quickly learned from my old office that resiliency was a necessary component for policy options. If you are not safe, you will be restricted in what you can be doing offensively, defensively, and otherwise. I'd also like to add, if we're talking from a legislative perspective, I do believe that Congress can have an impact on the federal workforce. And as a couple of my concluding statements in my written statement said, this is a qualitative, not a quantitative game. Cyber expertise is about having the highest level of competence. The greatest breakthroughs in information technology have not been because there were 1,000 people in the room. The greatest breakthroughs in encryption, in hardware and software have been by small entities. We need to ensure that some of those cyber Olympians are working in the federal workforce and stay there.
Amen.
My last comment will be, it's wrong to think about this as cybersecurity. There is no solution for perfect cybersecurity if you are up against determined, well-resourced adversaries. This is about risk management and risk mediation. The future discussions would be most served for the public good if they were about a cyber risk discussion, or even better, information risk to include integrity concerns. Shifting that intellectual framework to information risk will help you a long way towards addressing some of the issues that this panel has raised today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Painter?
So I think the number one thing, and given my experience, is to maintain the momentum and the focus on this issue and the education on this issue. Look, you know, even 5 or 6 years ago, and at the end of the Bush administration, there was a comprehensive national cyber initiative. Back in 2003, we had a cybersecurity strategy that became shelfware because people at the time weren't ready to deal with it. I think now we're in a different place, but I think it needs to be made a priority and continue to be a priority, not just for this administration, but whoever the next administration is. Now, I think we're in a good shape there because I think now, because there are hearings like this and your Senate colleagues in SFRC, I've testified before them, we've done a report to Congress about all of our activities across the board in cyber, including throughout the different range. I think that's all important. But the focus really needs to continue on this and be seen as a priority. 5 years ago, when my office was created at the State Department, there was no real cyber diplomacy program. We now have 22, I think, countries around the world that have counterparts to me that didn't exist, where we can actually not just have dialogues about policy, but when we have an attack like the denial of service attacks against our financial institutions, I can reach out to counterparts and I can say, look, this is important. This is not just the normal technical issue. So that's important. What I'd say we don't need, you know, for my department, because we are we really cross-cut among all the different parts of our department, is, you know, I know there's some proposed legislation to kind of stovepipe this issue and put it into one particular chain and create, you know, more bureaucracy, in my opinion. I'd say that's not helpful to us. What we really need is to be able to mainstream this throughout the department and really throughout our foreign policy.
Ms. Hughes, you get the last words. No pressure.
Well, first and foremost, as my panelists have said, continue the dialogue. I think awareness across the United States and the American people of cyber threats and vulnerabilities is important. The adversaries aren't using sophisticated tactics to steal data. They're using the low-hanging fruit, and there's such a lack of basic hygiene that they don't need to resort to nation-state level capabilities to steal information. So continuing the dialogue and awareness is important, because the interdependencies between government networks, private sector networks, foreign entities, I mean, we're all so intertwined that a vulnerability in one can lead to a vulnerability for all. And then tactically, I would second again what Mr. Canuck said in terms of workforce improvements, workforce management. I know the most recent NDAA provided the Department of Defense a little bit more flexibility with the cyber accepted service provisions, and we plan to take advantage of that to improve our ability to hire and retain talented cyber professionals.
Excellent. Well,
Add that also, I wanted to thank Congress for the recent cyber information sharing legislation. That has helped. So.
you're welcome. Without objection, I'd like to enter my full opening remarks for the record. So ordered. And I'd like to thank our witnesses today for taking the time to appear before us. It's a very important conversation that needs to continue. And if there's no further business, without objection, the subcommittees stand adjourned.